Scalia Speaks, Chapter 18, Religious Retreats. Antonin Scalia graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown University in 1957 and was the valedictorian of his class. In April 1998, he spoke at Georgetown to students who had taken part in a retreat program and offered some very personal reflections on what life had taught him in the intervening 4 decades. Father Paul Scalia recalls one occasion on which his father spoke to me quite excitedly about the retreat he had just attended. His time away had clearly served its purpose, bringing him to reflect more upon his faith and to deepen his devotion. The little instruction sheet I got after I agreed to give this talk said that I should not talk about values in the abstract, but should relate a few instances from my own life in which my values bore upon my decisions. I will do my best, though the fact is that I am not very good at such anecdotal discourse. I also detest the term values, which suggests to me a greater degree of interchangeability than ought to exist, as though the principles that guide a man's life are something like monetary exchange rates subject to change with the times, as in, the value of the yen has fallen. I prefer the view of things expressed by Sir Thomas More in the play A Man for All Seasons, when his friend, the Duke of Norfolk, urged him to sign the damned accession to the divorce, even if he doesn't really agree with it. Some men think the earth is round, others think it flat. It is a matter capable of question. But if it is flat, will the king's command make it round? And if it is round, will the king's command flatten it? No, I will not sign. You have just returned from a retreat. Any person who believes in the transcendental has to go on a retreat periodically, because the world believes in the pragmatic rather than the transcendental, and you will lose your soul, that is to say, forget what and who you are, if you do not get away from the noise now and then to think about the first things. In the Gospels, of course, Jesus is constantly going off all by himself, and he doubtless needed it less than we do. The most memorable retreat of my life was the one that I made at the end of my senior year in high school, a Jesuit high school, St. Francis Xavier in New York. It was so memorable because it was the year in which the big decision had to be made, whether to go on to college or, as many of my classmates did, to go on to St. Andrews on Hudson, the Jesuit seminary for the New York province. I might have made a heck of a Jesuit, though perhaps somewhat out of step these days, but I concluded I had certain talents that might do more good out in the world. And I am not referring exclusively to my capacity to procreate, though it is true that I have 9 children. I was affected, I might add, by the fact that I was, at the end of my family, the only descendant of a previous generation that consisted on both sides of 9 brothers and sisters. Anyway, a retreat was a good occasion to think that through, and of course, to pray for guidance. I somehow got out of the habit of making retreats. The world crept in, which is what those of us who do not enter the seminary or the convent, and perhaps many of those who do, have to worry about. I have gotten back into the habit in the last 10 years, and I recommend it to you. If you don't have a weekend to spare once a year to think excessively about the things that really matter, well, you haven't planned your life correctly. Another thing I can tell you, with an anecdote or two to back it up, is that things do not work out the way you want, but the way God wants. And sometimes what seems to you a crushing disappointment may, in fact, be a great blessing. I won a Naval ROTC fellowship when I graduated from high school. It was very hard to get in those days. All I had to do to cash in on the fellowship was to be accepted at a college that had Naval ROTC. As it happened, the only college that did, which I was interested in attending, and very interested in attending, was Princeton. And Princeton turned me down. A major disappointment. So I came to Georgetown instead. And I am sure I am a different person, and a better person, than I would have been if my will had been done. The next biggest disappointment in my life was the morning in Palo Alto, California. I was teaching at Stanford Law School. When I received a phone call from the Attorney General informing me that of the 2 finalists whom he had interviewed for the post of Solicitor General, I had not been chosen. A really bad call on his part, I thought, and a bitter and unexpected disappointment for me. But had I become SG, I have little doubt that I would not be on the Supreme Court today. So pray for things, but accept what you are given. He knows better than you what is for your own good. If you have transcendental principles, which for Catholics means if you believe in Jesus Christ and his church, they have to shape your entire worldview. Perhaps the best lesson I ever learned here at Georgetown occurred during my oral comprehensive examination in my major, history, at the end of my senior year. My history professor was Dr. Wilkinson, a prince of a man. He was the chairman of the 3-professor panel that examined me. And I did, if I may say so myself, a smashingly good job. As the time for the examination was almost at hand, Dr. Wilkinson asked me one last question, which seemed to be a softball. Of all the historical events you have studied, he said, which one in your possession had the most impact upon the world? How could I possibly get this wrong? There was obviously no single correct answer. The only issue was what good answer I should choose. The French Revolution, perhaps, or the Battle of Thermopylae, or of Lepanto, or the American Revolution. I forget what I picked, because it was all driven out of my mind when Dr. Wilkinson informed me of the right answer, or at least the right answer if I really believed what he and I thought I believed. Of course, it was the Incarnation. Point taken. You must keep everything in perspective and not run your spiritual life and your worldly life as though they are 2 separate operations. And finally, I want to tell you something my father told me that I have never forgotten. You are all here at Georgetown devoted to the life of the mind, admiring your brilliant professors and envying perhaps your brilliant classmates. My father was also committed to the life of the mind, much more of an intellectual than I ever was or can be. He taught Romance languages at Brooklyn College, and of course, once you have mastered the grammar of a language, there is nothing to do but read all the great literature and philosophy that has been written in that language, which is what my father did. And my mother described it. He always had a book in front of his face. So this was not a man who spurned the life of the mind. But on one occasion, he told me this. I have never forgotten it. And if you take anything away from this talk, I hope it will be this. Son, brains are like muscles. You can rent them by the hour. The only thing that is not for sale is character. Keep things in perspective, including the value of this education you are getting. At the end of the day, it is not that which will make you a good or bad person.